Tonight we drift backward into the cold corridors of history, to a place known for its elegance and remembered for its end. The R.M.S. Titanic was a marvel, the height of human ambition, floating on a sea that could not be tamed. But beneath the chandeliers and the silver service, far below the music and luxury, something darker stirred. This is not just the story of a sinking ship. It is the unraveling of a man. His name was Thomas Vale, and he went down with more than steel and rivets. This is his confession. This is the weight of justice, or madness, beneath the black.
April 12th, 1912. 2 days into the voyage, Thomas Vale's world was heat and iron. The walls around him hissed and groaned, alive with pressure. The belly of the Titanic breathed fire and coal dust, sweat and soot. Down here, where the engines roared and the furnaces burned white-hot, there was no sign of the luxury above. Just the endless clatter of shovels, the clang of metal on metal, and the screaming lungs of men turned to shadows. Vale's shirt clung to his back, soaked through. His hands, blistered and blackened, worked with methodical detachment, shoveling coal into the furnace with the precision of a metronome. 1, 2, 3. He lost count, always did. The rhythm was the only time that passed. "Keep up, Vale," barked a voice from the catwalk above, Foreman Blythe. "You fall behind again, and I'll have you on latrine duty till we dock." Vale didn't answer, didn't even look up. He kept shoveling, jaw clenched tight. The heat behind his eyes wasn't just sweat. It was anger. Old, slow burning. The kind that soaked into your bones until you forgot what it felt like to be calm. He used to be a teacher, a quiet man with clean shirts and chalk-stained fingers. Now he was a furnace rat in the grandest ship ever built. Funny, how quickly the world buried you. The ship was beautiful. Everyone said so. He'd seen glimpses. The polished mahogany staircases, the chandeliers like starlight caught in crystal, the hushed piano music wafting through the upper corridors. Titanic was a floating cathedral, and Vale was one of the priests no one saw. He was allowed above deck only in the early hours to fetch laundry or deliver messages. He moved like a ghost then, careful not to be noticed, careful not to stare too long at the men in silk waistcoats or the women in ivory gowns. It was a cruel kind of beauty, that ship, because it reminded you what you were not. He once paused too long outside the grand dining room and caught a glimpse inside. Candelabras, gold trim, white gloves, laughter like birdsong. A man in a tuxedo handed a pearl-handled cane to a steward. Vale turned away before they could see the smudge of soot on his cheek. By April 13th, the tension among the lower crew was growing. Not because of any one thing, but because of everything. The officers barked orders with increasing sharpness. A girl in the laundry was slapped for tearing a silk cuff. A boy in the engine room collapsed from heat exhaustion and was carried off like a sack of meat. The whispers started then. "There's ice in these waters." Saw it myself past Newfoundland. Great black shapes floating just under. They're ignoring the warnings. Too proud, the lot of them. Vale listened. Always listened. The pride of command was well known below deck. They called Titanic unsinkable. Even the word tasted arrogant. He began keeping a small notebook again, a habit from better days. His entries were short, scratched in pencil by lantern light in his narrow bunk. April 13th. They toast in crystal. We drown in sweat. Saw a man drop his tea tray. Officer made him lick the floor clean. No room for mistakes on a perfect ship. He drew a tiny iceberg beside the note. Just a triangle, barely more than a mark. That night, Vale dreamed of water, not crashing or roaring, just rising, slow and cold. He stood ankle-deep in the hallway outside his bunk, watching the sea creep in through the floorboards. Voices echoed above, laughter, violin music, but no one came down. No one saw. The water reached his knees, then his chest. And when he opened his mouth to scream, only salt came out. He awoke gasping, his sheets damp with sweat, the clank of chains and steam hammers echoing from the walls like distant thunder. April 14th, the day it all began. Vale was assigned to assist with linen changes in the first-class wing. He moved through the corridors like furniture, silent and barely seen. A maid trailed behind him with fresh towels. At the far end of the hallway, 2 officers leaned against the wall, speaking in low voices. Vale paused near the doorframe, listening. Ice warnings again. 4th today. Captain says full steam ahead. Wants to beat Olympics record. The man's not worried. He says Titanic could sail through a field of razors and not take a scratch. They laughed. Vale didn't. He returned to the lower decks and sat with his notebook. April 14th. They laugh at warnings. They think steel is God. Let them test it. Let the sea decide. Later that night, as the shift ended, Vale lingered in the passageway by Boiler Room 5. His hands throbbed, blistered anew. A tremor passed through the floor, so subtle most wouldn't notice. Then the sound. A long, low groan. Not metal on metal. Not anything mechanical. It was the sound of resistance, of something vast colliding with something blind. He stood, listened. Then came the shouts. Iceberg! Did you feel that? The hull's scraped. Men ran. Orders were shouted. Above deck, somewhere far above, people stirred in confusion. Not panic, not yet. Vale didn't move. He pressed a hand to the wall. Cold. Too cold. A smile, faint and strange, touched his lips. Not panic. Purpose. The ship is wounded. Let it bleed. And let the guilty bleed with it. He tucked his notebook away. And for the first time in weeks, Thomas Vale felt something close to peace. The great ship had struck ice. The tremor that rippled through the steel was subtle but final, like the moment after a bone snaps. Not a scream, but silence. The Titanic barely shuddered as it sliced along the jagged face of the berg. Above deck, passengers in evening wear paused mid-toast. Below, in the engine rooms and boiler corridors, men froze mid-shovel. Thomas Vale had felt it. Not just the scrape, but the change. The hush afterward. The mechanical breath of the ship seemed to pause, as if the Titanic herself realized what she'd done. Then came the orders. Barked, confused. Not panicked, not yet. Shut the dampers. Seal the watertight doors. Boiler Room 6 is taking water. The men ran. Some argued. Others obeyed blindly. Vale stood perfectly still. He had been waiting for this. Up above, the music still played. Passengers laughed nervously, sipping champagne, brushing off concerns. It's nothing, they were told. A precaution. The ship is perfectly safe. The officers didn't mention the flooding compartments, or that the first 5 were already breached, or that the ship was designed to float with only 4. Vale moved through the servant passageways with a strange calm. A steward passed him, panting and pale, eyes wide. "They say we've hit something. Ice. They're checking the damage." Vale nodded, expression blank. He continued on, notebook tucked beneath his coat. Hands clean, for now. The iceberg had struck first. Now it was his turn. He began with Purser Atlee, a petty tyrant in a white uniform. Atlee had spent the last 2 days mocking the steerage passengers, laughing at their prayer circles, barking at his subordinates. Vale had once watched him shove a kitchen boy to the ground for bringing soup too slowly. He found him near the mailroom, standing by the sealed bulkhead, arguing with a young crewman. "Get this open. I need to retrieve the safes." "The water's rising, sir. They sealed it on orders." "Well then, unseal it, idiot." Vale approached from behind. "Excuse me, sir," he said, low and calm. Atlee turned, already annoyed. "What is it?" The coal shovel came down hard. One strike. Just one. The crewman screamed. Vale dropped the shovel and ran. In the chaos, it would be blamed on panic, on something falling. No one would look for a killer. Not yet. In the servants' galley, steam curled from forgotten kettles. A pot of tea boiled over and hissed into the dark. Vale moved through the shadows, stepping over abandoned trays and dropped napkins. Somewhere above, passengers were gathering in life jackets, still joking about an unscheduled swim. He passed a mirror in the hallway and caught his reflection. Something was wrong with his face. Not blood, not dirt, just wrong. His eyes looked older, sharper. His mouth didn't know how to smile anymore. He opened his notebook. April 15th. Early. The ship is bleeding. I am the scalpel. The sea will have its fill, but not before I make my cuts. He flipped to a list on the back page. Names, short descriptions. Langford spit on a child in steerage. Yates beat a stoker unconscious. Mrs. Halcroft mocked a stewardess for weeping. Finch cornered the Irish maid near the cargo lift. He chose one. Finch was drunk, as usual. The man stumbled through a corridor on E-deck, still in uniform but reeking of brandy. He was headed for the lower pantry, likely to find another bottle. He didn't see Vale waiting in the shadows near the stairwell. Vale grabbed him by the collar and dragged him into the supply closet. "What the hell?" Finch's voice died with the first blow. A corkscrew, sharp, efficient, brutal. When it was done, Vale knelt beside the body. He whispered, "The sea is coming, Mr. Finch. She remembers what you've done." He closed the door gently behind him. 12:20 a.m. The bow of the ship was already dipping. Passengers were noticing now, not just in their ears or their feet, but in their bones. The band still played, trying to keep spirits high. Officers moved quickly but spoke softly. Women were escorted to lifeboats with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Vale stood in the gallery above the main staircase, watching. His uniform was neat, his hair slicked back. No one saw the blood beneath his cuffs. He watched a young woman adjust her mother's shawl before climbing into a lifeboat. 2 men kissed their wives' hands and stepped back. A boy asked if he could bring his dog. Vale felt nothing. No satisfaction. No anger. Just clarity. He turned and walked downward into the rising cold. He passed the galley again. This time he saw her. The little girl, maybe 8 years old, standing alone beside a service cart. Her dark eyes met his. "You're hurting people," she said. He paused. "I'm saving the ship." She shook her head. "The ship's already dead." He knelt beside her. "Then I'm burying it, with truth, with justice." "You think it's justice," she whispered. "But it's just drowning. We're all drowning now." She ran before he could answer. He didn't follow. 12:45 a.m. The deck tilted farther. Water poured into the lower levels like a beast unchained. Screams began in earnest. Panic bloomed like fire. Vale returned to the crew quarters. A young stoker was packing a bag, frantic. "They're saying it's going down. Going down. Do you believe it?" "Yes," Vale said. "Then what do we do?" Vale looked him in the eyes. "You pray," he said, "and you listen." "To what?" "To the ocean. It forgives no one." As the first lifeboats were lowered into the freezing Atlantic, Thomas Vale slipped into the shadows once more. His spree was just beginning. The sea would take many that night, but before it did, so would he. It began with the lifeboats. One after another, they dropped unevenly into the black Atlantic, some half-filled, others crowded beyond safety. Stewards shouted orders, their voices cracking. Flares lit the sky like false dawn. Mothers clutched crying children. Men argued. Officers raised pistols. The bow was already slipping beneath the surface, and the stern groaned under the weight of denial. It was 12:40 a.m. The Titanic had 90 minutes left, and Thomas Vale walked through its unraveling like a ghost, finally unchained. He moved along E-deck, through the service corridors he knew by feel, past cabins already abandoned or left in disarray. The water had reached the lower stairwells. Panic surged in pulses now, sudden and primal. But Vale, he was calm. More than that, serene. Where others gasped and screamed, he breathed easily. Because this was right. The ship that had fed itself on suffering, on heat and hunger, on class and cruelty, was finally breaking. And now, in its final hours, he had work to finish. His first kill of the hour was near the men's smoking lounge, a wealthy passenger shoving past third-class children in line for the lifeboats. "Out of my way, damn you!" the man roared, elbowing a young boy who stumbled into a wall. Vale reached him moments later. "This way, sir," he said, guiding him down a corridor. The man followed without question, just another uniformed servant. But at the end of the passage was no boat, just a locked pantry and rising water. Vale pressed the man's head beneath the surface before he could cry out. Held it there. Bubbles. Then silence. He closed the door gently behind him. Everywhere the ship was dying louder. The ship's band played on, now slower, steadier, bowing through hymns with wet fingers and pale faces. Nearer, my God, to thee, drifted through the corridors like smoke. Officers called for order, but it was like speaking to fire. Doors slammed, windows shattered, families cried, strangers prayed together. Vale moved silently past the lines for lifeboats. At one boat, a child stood sobbing at the edge. Her mother was already loaded in, screaming for someone to lift the girl aboard. Vale knelt, scooped her up gently, and placed her beside her mother. He wiped her tears and smiled. But not 5 minutes later, He dragged a man out of line, a second-class guest who had disguised himself in a steward's coat to steal a place in the boat. Vale said nothing as he led him away and shoved him into the flooding cargo deck. The man screamed until his voice became gurgles. The bodies began appearing more frequently now. Some collapsed from shock, some trampled in the stairwells, some already drowned in the rising cold below. Vale passed them without pause. He still held his notebook, though most of the pages were soaked through. The ink ran in streaks across the names, the verdicts. His hands trembled. He couldn't tell if it was the cold or something deeper. He found a young steward slumped against a bulkhead, coughing blood. "Help me," the boy gasped. Vale knelt beside him. "You did no harm," he whispered. "Rest." The boy died minutes later. Vale stayed by him until the water reached their knees. It was near 1:30 a.m. when he saw her again. The girl, the same one from the corridor before. She stood barefoot on the deck outside the Café Parisien, hands clenched around her elbows, watching the chaos unfold. She looked at him, and this time, didn't flinch. "You're still doing it," she said. "You think they deserve it. They do. Number some of them. Not all." "You weren't there," he snapped, louder than he meant. "You didn't shovel the coal. You didn't get kicked when you fell. You didn't see the boy whipped for sleeping during break." She looked around at the dying ship. "I see now. And you know what I see?" "What?" "A monster." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. He felt it cut through him. "You're not a judge. You're just another reason to be afraid." Then she turned and disappeared into the crowd. Vale didn't follow. He dropped the notebook into the water. The ship groaned louder now, a sound like the world being ripped open. 1:45 a.m. The bow was fully submerged. The stern lifted slowly into the night air. Passengers began slipping across the sloped deck like marbles on glass. Men screamed prayers. Women held their children tighter. The band finally stopped. Water poured into the grand staircase. Crystal chandeliers burst. Gilded mirrors shattered. Carpets unrolled into the sea like tongues of velvet. Vale walked through the rising tide in the first-class reception area, now a cathedral of ruin. He passed a portrait of Ismay, the White Star Line's chairman, lying face down in a puddle. He laughed. He laughed until he cried. 1:55 a.m. The lights flickered once, twice. Then they died forever. Darkness swallowed the ship. Someone screamed. Someone sang. Somewhere, a flare burst above the mast, then fell into the sea, sputtering. Vale stood on the grand staircase, now nearly underwater. He took off his steward's coat, folded it neatly, and placed it on the banister. Water climbed the walls. He stepped forward. Cold met his chest, then his chin, then his lips. And then, nothing but the black. 2 a.m. The last lifeboat had gone. There were no more commands, no more reassurances, no more lies. Only the truth now, sharp and cold and rising fast. Above, the Titanic's stern pointed skyward like a gravestone against the stars. The bow was long gone beneath the sea. The deck split at impossible angles. Hundreds still clung to railings, pipes, doors. Anything that might delay the inevitable. They cried for help, for God, for someone to say it wasn't real. But Thomas Vale said nothing. He stood just beneath the second funnel, water licking the soles of his boots, watching the final madness unfold. He no longer killed. There was no need. The sea was finishing the work for him. The ship screamed, not metaphorically, screamed. Steel bent in ways it never should, groaning like tortured bone. Bolts popped from the hull like gunshots, railings ripped from their moorings. A smokestack collapsed with a blast that sent 20 people into the air like dolls. Screams pierced the dark, echoing off the endless water. Vale didn't move. A man brushed past him, eyes bulging, gasping for breath. "Help me!" the man sobbed, grabbing at his sleeve. "Please, please!" Vale only blinked. There's no one left to help you. And the sea, patient and certain, began to rise over the man's shoulders. He wandered what remained of the upper decks. Bodies floated face down. Others still struggled, teeth chattering violently before silence took them. Doors and deck chairs bobbed in the flood like forgotten relics. A lifebelt drifted past with no one in it. The stars had never looked so clear, the sky so calm. The contrast made it worse. Vale walked toward the stern. A few dozen people still clung to the rails, pressed against one another, white-knuckled and wide-eyed. Somewhere nearby, a priest recited prayers over the shrieking wind. Someone sang a lullaby, badly off-key, but steady. Then, a thunderclap of steel. The Titanic broke. The sound cracked the heavens. The deck lurched violently. Bodies tumbled forward. Water exploded upward like a geyser as the stern, momentarily released from its burden, settled back on the surface. Vale held onto a pipe, watching. He was weightless in the chaos, untouched. He descended toward the aft rail, boots sliding, arms spread for balance. Around him, people wept, begged, leapt. Some froze in place like statues, paralyzed by fear. Vale looked up. The stern was beginning its final ascent. 2:10 a.m., 10 minutes left. He passed the broken remains of the Marconi room, sparks still flickering from its walls. He saw the coat of an officer draped over a davit, sleeve torn, brass buttons gleaming. He saw a woman whispering to a dead husband, stroking his hair as seawater pooled around her waist. He passed them all. No one looked at him now. No one cared who he was or what he'd done. All were equal in the water's eyes. At the very end, he found himself at the top rail, the last point of the Titanic still above the sea. A young man clung beside him, eyes wild. "We can still jump. The suction, maybe if we wait." Vale just looked at him, almost kindly. "There's no more escape," he said. "Then why are you up here?" Vale didn't answer. He removed the last page of his ruined notebook, torn and smeared, and tucked it into the young man's pocket. "If you live," he said, "remember what this place was." Then he turned away. 2:17 a.m. The final plunge began. The stern lifted once more, higher, higher, an impossible angle, and then groaned forward. For a few eternal seconds, all sound ceased. Then the sea swallowed it. The deck buckled under Vale's feet. He fell, not panicked, but surrendering. Cold water punched the air from his lungs. He tumbled end over end, crashing into the black, limbs flailing, ribs cracking. And then, nothing but depth. Lightless, endless. He sank. He did not swim. The cold erased thought. Time. Self. He opened his mouth and let the salt in. His final thought was not of revenge or judgment or the names in his notebook. It was of fire and steam and the pounding of boots in a tunnel that no longer existed. He thought, I never left the engine room. And then, nothing. Dawn, April 15th, 1912. The North Atlantic was calm. The sky had gone from black to bruised violet. And where once the greatest ship ever built had stood, there was only wreckage, only ruin. The Carpathia found 700 survivors adrift in the lifeboats, but thousands had slipped beneath. Among the bodies recovered, one steward's coat was found floating on a piece of paneling, torn, empty. A scrap of paper tucked in the pocket, frozen stiff with salt. 5 words remained legible. He had always been apart.
The Titanic rests now, silent and broken beneath the Atlantic, its stories scattered, its ghosts forgotten. But in the dark, among the wreckage, there are still echoes of footsteps in flooded hallways, of breath held beneath judgment, and maybe, just maybe, if you listen closely, you can still hear the name of the man who walked into the water, because he believed the ocean was more fair than the world above it. Thomas Vale, Steward, Shadow, Reckoning. Thank you for listening to Beneath the Black. Sleep well, if you can.